Who raised you more, your parents, your grandparents, or someone else?
It was Easter Sunday, just past 1 in the afternoon, and my mother had already finished her second glass of white Zinfandel when she leaned back in her chair, crossed one leg over the other like she was posing for a goddamn Southern Living photo shoot, and with a smirk that didn't quite reach her eyes, let the sentence slide out with deliberate cruelty, "You're too old to be living here rent-free, Leah." She said it like a joke, like it was just another harmless jab tossed between bites of deviled eggs and spiral ham, but I knew better. Everyone at that table knew better. My father's fork paused halfway to his mouth. My younger sister Chloe looked down and hid a grin behind her mimosa. The kids, her three, all under the age of 12, didn't get it, but they felt it. That shift in the room. That heavy silence that always seemed to follow when Mom opened her mouth and decided to make me her target for the day. I laughed, not because I found it funny, but because I'd learned that silence only made her repeat herself louder, meaner, and with more smug confidence. It was the laugh of someone who's been punched too many times in the same spot to even flinch. What none of them knew, what none of them ever bothered to ask, was that just the night before, I had finished paying off the last of their mortgage payments. 142 installments, each one drafted quietly from my account and funneled directly into their lender's portal, disguised as some family savings account that no one ever logged into except me. $84,000. Gone. Not a thank you, not a question, not a damn nod in my direction. I had been back in this house for just over 2 years. When I left my husband, I had nowhere to go, no one to stay with, and frankly no strength left to pretend like I was okay. The divorce was a slow, humiliating train wreck that ended with him walking out with our savings, our car, and the last sliver of my self-worth. I told Mom and Dad it would be temporary. I'd just need a few months to get back on my feet. I was 40 years old at the time. 40. And when I rang the doorbell that night, yes, rang it, they acted surprised I didn't have some friend's couch or hotel lined up. Like this wasn't their problem to deal with. Like I was someone else's mess to clean up. But I came anyway. I unpacked my suitcase in the same room I slept in during middle school. I kept my head down. I landed a remote consulting contract a few weeks later, tech finance, B2B mergers, and worked long hours behind my bedroom door. I made good money. Quiet money. But in this house, silence was interpreted as weakness. If I wasn't bragging about bonuses or buying new shoes every other week like Chloe, then clearly I was just mooching off the parents and scrolling Facebook all day. Chloe, of course, had married well. Her husband, Dan, worked in commercial real estate and always had a perfectly whitened smile and a handshake that lasted just 1 second too long. They bought a 4-bedroom in Naperville, had 3 kids by 35, and posted Christmas cards that looked like Crew catalog covers. And while my sister pretended to pity me, she also never hesitated to point out loudly and often that some people just don't bounce back after a divorce the way others do. That brunch, she was sitting at the end of the table, stirring her mimosa with a strawberry slice and nodding slightly as Mom made her little comment about my living situation. I looked around that table, Mom, smug in her pastel cardigan, Chloe all but preening with her picture-perfect life, Dad hiding behind his second helping of potato salad, and I realized something that hit me harder than I expected. They genuinely believed I was a burden. A grown woman eating their food, sleeping under their roof, coasting through life like some Arrested Development charity case. They had no idea. Not a single clue. And I had let them believe it. I had allowed their judgment to wrap around me like a wet blanket for 2 full years, smothering any pride I had left. That's when it happened. I stood up to take my plate to the sink, pretending not to notice the glances being exchanged between Chloe and Mom, and as I leaned over the counter and turned on the faucet, I pulled my phone out of my back pocket, unlocked it, and tapped into the banking app one had used nearly every week since moving back. Under the Scheduled Payments tab, I found it, Monroe Mortgage Auto Draft, due April 15th. I tapped cancel. It asked me to confirm. I pressed yes. Just like that, it was done. No more monthly bailouts. No more silent martyrdom. I rinsed my plate and stared out the window, watching Chloe's kids chasing each other around the backyard tulips, their pastel outfits already stained with chocolate and juice. For a moment, I felt something like relief. Not joy, not anger. Just the kind of hollow peace that comes when you finally decide to stop holding your breath. And in that quiet moment, I asked myself the question I hadn't dared to consider until now: what exactly have I been waiting for? Their gratitude? Their apology? Or just permission to stop sacrificing myself for people who never once offered to do the same? I dried my hands, set the plate in the rack, and turned back to the table. "Anyone want coffee?" I asked. They all shook their heads. No one even looked at me. I walked back to my seat, folded my napkin neatly, and waited for dessert. Because tomorrow I'd be gone. And when they found out just how much they'd lost, I didn't want them to say I left in anger. I wanted them to feel the silence I had lived in for 2 years, and maybe, just maybe, they'd finally hear it. The morning after Easter felt like any other, quiet, gray-skied, a little too cold for spring, but not cold enough to complain about, except something in the air had shifted, not outside, but within me, as if that single moment at the table, that smug, effortless jab from my mother had cracked open a door in my mind I'd spent years keeping sealed shut, and now, with the smallest push, it had opened just wide enough to let everything flood in. I moved through the house on silent feet, making coffee in the same old stained percolator that rattled and hissed on the back burner like a relic from a decade no one wanted to revisit. And as the smell of burnt grounds drifted up into the kitchen and clung to the faded curtains, I leaned against the counter and stared at the empty space above the sink, the one where a picture used to hang, something generic like a farmhouse or a vase of lilacs, long since taken down for repainting and never returned, leaving behind 4 thumbtack holes and a faint rectangle of the old wall color, a soft beige that had once seemed welcoming and now just looked like the past refusing to fully let go. It was in that small domestic moment that I realized I had become invisible in this house, not just unnoticed or unappreciated, but willfully unseen, like I had taken on the role of ghost, haunting the halls of a family that still lived and laughed and judged all around me without ever truly acknowledging my presence beyond the ways in which I inconvenienced them. They saw me only as far as their discomfort reached: an extra plate at the table, an occupied parking spot in the driveway, a closed bedroom door that signaled the shame they projected onto me more than it ever reflected anything real. And yet, all this time, while they carried on with their cocktail hours and game nights, while Mom rotated her seasonal wreaths on the front door like the world depended on it, and Dad tinkered with the lawnmower for the 10th time in a month to avoid conversation, I had been the one keeping the very ground beneath their feet from collapsing. They didn't know, of course, that the bank had nearly foreclosed on this house 2 years ago, just 6 weeks after I moved in, when I was still too shell-shocked from my divorce to do anything but cry silently into my pillow at night and nod politely through family dinners I wasn't ready to attend. They didn't know because I intercepted the notice in the mail, a thick, unfriendly envelope that my mother would have thrown in a drawer and pretended didn't exist until the sheriff showed up with a clipboard and a final warning. I read it, called the lender, and within 48 hours had arranged the first of what would become a long, numbing series of emergency payments. At the time, I told myself it was temporary, that I was just helping out, that once I was on my feet again, I'd move out and they'd figure it out on their own. But somewhere along the way, that temporary solution became routine, and that routine turned into silence, and that silence, over time, turned into something more insidious: erasure. Not once did they ask how the mortgage had magically sorted itself out. Not once did they question the sudden disappearance of final notice letters or the appearance of confirmation emails in the old joint inbox my father barely checked. They accepted it, as people like them always do, as if life simply corrected itself in their favor, as if comfort and rescue were things that fell from the sky rather than came from the quiet, consistent labor of someone they thought beneath them. And I let them believe it. Maybe I even needed them to believe it, because the alternative, standing up and saying, "You would have lost this house without me," felt too desperate, too hungry for praise, and God knows praise was never a currency that spent well in this family. We dealt in disappointment, in superiority, in veiled comments about who had failed whom and when. But yesterday had changed something in me, not suddenly, but deeply, as if I had finally realized that the game I had been playing was never going to end in a win, not unless I changed the rules. So I did. After canceling the auto payment the night before, I didn't sleep much. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my phone clutched to my chest like a lifeline, the silence around me thicker than usual, almost comforting in its stillness, and I thought about every deposit I'd made into their lives, every dollar, every hour, every emotion, and how they'd deposited nothing back except resentment and judgment. The balance was not only off, it was insulting. That morning, after my coffee, I pulled out my laptop, opened a private email thread with my old friend Serena, now a realtor in Lincoln Park who specialized in corporate relocations and furnished temporary housing, and I typed only one sentence. I need a furnished one-bedroom, private, long-term, available immediately. I hit send, closed the laptop, and felt a strange rush of calm. Not elation. Not victory. Just the first deep breath I'd taken in 2 years that didn't feel like it needed to be apologized for. I packed slowly throughout the day, careful not to make noise, not because I was hiding, but because I wanted the moment of realization to hit after I was gone. I wanted them to find the void, not watch it happen in real time. I folded my clothes with precision, wrapping each sweater and blouse like it mattered, because it did. Because for too long, I had treated myself like an afterthought, and this act of packing was, in its own small way, a reclamation of dignity. And when Serena responded 3 hours later with a link to a quiet garden apartment tucked into the edge of Ravenswood, just far enough from downtown to feel calm, and just close enough to remind me that the world still moved outside this mausoleum of false perfection, I knew I would take it without even needing to see it. I sent the deposit. Signed the lease. Move in, tomorrow morning. The thing is, they still hadn't noticed. Not my packed bags. Not the change in my voice. Not the fact that I wasn't sitting down to dinner, that I wasn't filling the dishwasher, that I wasn't participating in their evening's small talk and political grumbles. They didn't notice because they didn't care to. And so, I made a choice. If they could go 2 years ignoring everything I'd done, then they could damn well go one more day without realizing that tomorrow I'd be gone. But they'd notice eventually. And when they did, it wouldn't be me they'd miss. It would be the quiet miracle that had been keeping their world from burning down. And that miracle had just walked away without a sound. There's a particular weight to packing when you're not just leaving a house, but disentangling yourself from a history you never fully agreed to participate in, and as I folded my clothes, meticulously, almost ritualistically, into the old green Samsonite suitcase that had followed me through 3 apartments, 1 failed marriage, and now this claustrophobic return to childhood, I found myself moving slower with each drawer I emptied, not because I didn't want to leave, but because every object I touched seemed to carry some echo of a life I had outgrown but never been allowed to shed entirely. The room, still painted the same faded lilac it had been since I was 16, seemed almost smug in its permanence, as if it knew how many times I had tried to reinvent myself outside its 4 walls, only to be dragged back by circumstance, by guilt, by that peculiar kind of family loyalty that sounds noble in theory, but feels more like a chokehold when you're on the receiving end of it. As I reached for the shoebox on the top shelf of the closet, one I hadn't opened since before the divorce, maybe even longer, I felt the familiar ache settle into my chest. That ache that comes not from heartbreak or grief, but from the exhaustion of carrying memories that were never properly mourned, only buried. Inside the box were the artifacts of a life that, at some point, I had believed might go differently. Faded photos of college parties where I wore too much eyeliner and smiled too wide. Ticket stubs from road trips with my ex-husband when we still believed we were building something lasting. Birthday cards signed in my father's stiff, almost apologetic handwriting, always with a little more space between love and dad than necessary. As if he were offering affection on loan, expecting it to be returned. Beneath the photos was an envelope I recognized instantly even though I hadn't seen it in over 20 years, off-white, worn at the corners, my name scrawled in blue ink across the front. It had once been labeled Leah's college fund and was ceremoniously handed to me by my mother the summer before senior year, accompanied by one of her speeches that started with "Your father," and "I have always done the best we could," and ended with, "So make this count, okay?" At the time, I had smiled, said thank you, and tucked it away without opening it, assuming it was better to have the security without knowing the exact number. It wasn't until the tuition bill arrived that fall, and I'd tried to use it, that I learned it was empty. Not a check, not a dollar, not even a note. Just an empty envelope carrying a weight it had no right to bear. When I asked her about it, she blamed the market, then the cost of Chloe's braces, then Dad's truck breaking down. The order changed depending on her mood, but the message was always the same. "We meant to help you, but life got in the way, and now it's your problem." I stared at the envelope now, still weightless in my hand, and wondered why I had kept it. Maybe as proof that I hadn't imagined it. Maybe because I had always been waiting for someone to fill it, not with money but with an apology. Something simple. Something real. But no apology had ever come, not when I had to take out loans that strangled my 20s, not when I dropped out of grad school because I couldn't afford both rent and books, not when I moved back home after the divorce, dragging behind me not just suitcases, but the shame of failure that my mother never hesitated to spotlight in front of others with phrases like, "Well, she's just figuring things out still." As if I were some wandering spirit who hadn't yet chosen to be an adult. I folded the envelope in half, slowly, and placed it back in the box. Not because I needed it, but because I wanted them to see it missing when they finally noticed I was gone. I wanted them to feel, even for a moment, the vacuum I'd spent years trying to fill for them, financially, emotionally, even spiritually, only to be told I was somehow still in their debt. The room around me remained mostly untouched, a monument to their inability to see me as anything other than the version of myself that had once slept here, journaled in the corner chair, and cried quietly after bad dates and failed job interviews. The walls still had thumbtacks from posters long since removed. The bookshelf still held my high school yearbooks and a dusty copy of The Bell Jar with my annotations in the margins, as dramatic and unfiltered as any 17-year-old girl struggling to make sense of herself might be. It was as if the house had chosen to preserve this version of me, the one who still believed approval could be earned, who still tried to shrink herself to fit inside their expectations, because the reality of the woman I had become, flawed but functional, bruised but not broken, didn't fit the narrative they liked to tell at brunches and holiday dinners. The silence of the house was almost offensive. No one had knocked. No one had asked why my door stayed closed all morning. No one had noticed that the car keys were no longer hanging on the hook by the mudroom, or that my closet was half empty. They didn't ask because they didn't care to, because in their minds, I was already background noise. And in that silence, I began to understand something that should have been obvious long ago, that I had stayed not out of obligation, but out of some desperate hope that if I kept giving enough, they would one day decide I was worth something again. That the girl who'd once carried an empty envelope labeled college fund might one day be seen as the woman who'd kept their lives afloat without ever asking for recognition or repayment. But hope is a dangerous thing to cling to, especially when it's been weaponized against you for most of your life. So instead, I chose something else. I picked up my phone and opened the folder where I kept my financial records, just to look one last time at the numbers that no one in this house had ever bothered to ask about. There, neatly arranged in PDFs and spreadsheets, was the full breakdown of what I had paid over the last 2 years, mortgage payments, tax installments, even a few insurance premiums that had nearly lapsed without their knowledge. Over $84,000 in total. Money I could have used to restart my life. Money they assumed came from nowhere, or worse, didn't exist at all. I closed the folder and deleted the app from my phone. Tomorrow, they'd wake up to an empty room and a canceled bank account. And for the first time, they'd be forced to confront a version of reality they had spent years avoiding. A reality without me in it. Or, more accurately, a reality that no longer benefited from my silence. By the time the sun pulled itself over the horizon and spilled that familiar golden haze across the narrow kitchen floor, I was already dressed, packed, and seated at the counter with a lukewarm mug of coffee in hand. My suitcase waiting by the door like a silent witness to what felt less like a departure and more like a long overdue act of self-preservation. One of those quiet decisions that, once made, carry the weight not just of what you're choosing, but of everything you've endured to get. To the point where walking away becomes the only sane thing left to do. The house, as always in those early hours, creaked and sighed in its usual arthritic rhythm, the floors groaning under old secrets, the heating vents hissing in protest at another Midwest spring refusing to fully commit to warmth. It was, in every way, a morning like countless others, except for the fact that I would never sit at this counter again, would never walk past these cabinets in silence, pretending not to hear my mother's voice slicing through the air with that habitual mix of martyrdom and mockery she had honed into an art form over the years. The previous night had passed without comment, as if Easter brunch, complete with her offhand insult and the tight-lipped glances exchanged around the table, had vanished into some convenient void of selective memory. The way so many uncomfortable things did in this family. No one had knocked on my door. No one had followed up with a, "Hey, that was kind of harsh, huh?" No one had come in with a half-hearted apology or even a half-empty gesture of concern. And as much as I had told myself not to expect anything, not to hope, I'd be lying if I said there wasn't still a flicker inside me, a stubborn ember of the daughter I used to be, who kept thinking maybe this time, maybe this moment, they'd realize they'd gone too far. But of course, they didn't. They never did. So instead of staying up replaying conversations or imagining dramatic confrontations that would never come, I spent the night finishing what I had already started, packing the last of my belongings, organizing documents, wiping my laptop and switching passwords to accounts they never knew they had access to, and ensuring every thread I had woven into their lives was pulled neatly, efficiently, and completely free. I sat there for nearly an hour in that kitchen, sipping what had long ago gone cold, staring at the same dusty row of decorative cookbooks that my mother had never once opened, their spines pristine, their pages untouched to ornaments rather than tools. Much like everything else in this house, and I found myself wondering how many other things had been bought for appearances, but never actually used, how many emotions had been performed but never felt, how many relationships had been maintained not through love, but through guilt, habit, and the fear of judgment from the outside world. Because that was what mattered here, not truth, not connection, but the performance of normalcy. The illusion of a family that had it all together, one you could take pictures of and post on Facebook with carefully chosen captions and filtered smiles that hinted at warmth without ever showing the cracks beneath the surface. At exactly 7:30, just as the coffee pot clicked off with a final mechanical sigh, I heard the soft shuffle of my mother's slippers on the upstairs hallway, followed by the slow descent of her footsteps, measured and deliberate, as if she were giving the house time to notice her entrance before she graced it with her presence. She entered the kitchen in her usual morning uniform, robe tied too tightly, hair rolled and pinned, face bare but somehow still judgmental, and stopped when she saw me, her expression flickering, for the briefest of moments, with something that could have been surprise, but settled quickly into its default posture of mild irritation. "You're up early," she said, not quite a question, more of a challenge, as though my being awake before her disrupted some unspoken hierarchy she needed to maintain. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for once, felt nothing, not anger, not pain, not the familiar sting of wanting her approval, just an almost clinical detachment. The kind of clarity that comes not from resentment, but from having finally accepted that no apology was ever coming, and, even if it did, it wouldn't be for the right reasons. I stood slowly, placed the empty mug in the sink without a word, and walked past her to where my suitcase waited. I picked it up, adjusted the strap on my shoulder, and only then did I speak, my voice calm, even, but deliberately loud enough to cut through the silence like a scalpel. "Oh," I said, turning slightly at the doorway, "I forgot to mention, I canceled the mortgage payments last night." The words hung in the air like smoke, drifting and heavy and slow to dissipate. She blinked, her mouth opening slightly, as though her brain were trying to process a sentence that didn't align with the version of reality she had curated so carefully. Her face, always so controlled, so curated for display, flickered again, and this time the emotion that surfaced wasn't irritation or confusion, it was fear. "What?" she asked, her voice quieter than I'd ever heard it, almost hoarse. I stopped paying, I repeated, my tone gentle but firm, the way you might speak to a child who didn't yet understand the consequences of their actions. "They'll call you soon. Might want to check the mail. Oh, and the insurance, too. That's yours now." I didn't wait for a response. I didn't need one. I stepped out into the cool morning air, my breath visible for a moment as it left me, like a spirit I no longer had to carry. The sky was that soft gray blue that always precedes a spring rain, and for the first time in what felt like years, the silence didn't feel suffocating, it felt earned. As I opened the trunk of my car, Chloe's SUV pulled into the driveway, her window already down, a half smile on her face as she waved. "Hey, what's with the suitcase?" she called, leaning out, clearly unaware that anything in her perfect little world had shifted even an inch. I didn't answer. I just closed the trunk, climbed into the driver's seat, and pulled out slowly, watching in the rearview mirror as my mother stepped onto the porch, still barefoot, robe flapping slightly in the breeze, confusion carved deep into every line of her face. And, just like that, I was gone. No screaming. No scene. Just a vacuum where I used to be. And a silence that, for once, wasn't mine to carry. There's a certain kind of peace that only arrives once everything has burned down behind you, not the fiery, cinematic kind of destruction people imagine when they fantasize about revenge, but something quieter, colder, far more permanent. Like the smoldering stillness that follows a house fire, when the walls are gone, the roof has collapsed, and all that remains is a blackened silhouette of what used to be recognizable only in shape, not in substance. I sat on the balcony of my new apartment 2 days later, barefoot, cradling a chipped mug of too strong coffee that tasted nothing like home, but everything like freedom, and as I watched the light shift across the courtyard garden below, I let myself lean back into the metal chair and finally exhale, not just from my lungs, but from the hollow in my chest where all that history used to live. Moving in had been startlingly easy, the kind of transition that makes you wonder if the universe was just waiting for you to stop clinging to the wrong things. Serena had left the keys under the mat with a note scribbled on the back of a real estate flyer, "Knew you'd take it." No questions asked. The apartment was small but efficient, tastefully furnished in a way that felt intentionally impersonal, like it was built to remind people that this was a temporary stop, not a destination. But for me, it was perfect. Not because it felt like home, but because it didn't. Because after all these years of being told what home should look like, what family should feel like, I finally had a space that demanded nothing from me, required no performance, no bending, no explanation. I had barely slept the first night, not from nerves, but from the unsettling quiet of being alone in a place where no one would knock, no one would burst in, no one would comment on my breakfast or laundry or how long I had been in the shower. The absence of those small intrusions, those little insults wrapped in domesticity, felt like withdrawal from a drug I hadn't realized I'd been forced to take for decades. But on the second night, when I finally slept, I didn't dream about my mother's voice or my father's silence or Chloe's smirking little asides. I didn't dream at all. And somehow, that felt like a victory too. It would be easy to say that walking away was the revenge, that my silence, my absence, my refusal to participate any longer in the charade they had constructed was punishment enough. But the truth is, I had never been the kind of person who found satisfaction in passivity, in leaving things unsaid, in trusting people to understand what they'd lost. No, what they didn't know, and what I had never intended to tell them, was that the mortgage was only the beginning. What I had discovered 6 months earlier, entirely by accident, was something that, once I understood the full scope of it, had changed everything. Tucked deep inside a dusty old folder of family financial documents I'd been sorting through after a mild panic over their property taxes, I found a statement for an account I didn't recognize, an investment fund set up by my grandfather decades ago. Intended for me, named explicitly in the trust, with language so direct and deliberate it could have only come from someone who knew exactly how little faith he had in the generation he was leaving behind. The account had been sizable once, substantial enough that, had I known about it in my 20s, I might have finished grad school, started a business, or simply lived without the constant weight of financial panic shadowing every decision. But the balance had dwindled over time, slowly but steadily, eaten away by withdrawals made under my name, authorized, somehow, without my consent. At first, I assumed it was a mistake, a clerical error. But the trail was clear. The documents were signed. The transactions regular. Always small enough to avoid triggering any red flags. And always followed by a corresponding emergency in the family timeline, a medical bill here, a home repair there, Chloe's maternity leave, Dad's minor heart scare, Mom's knee surgery. All those little crises they'd mentioned in passing without ever once looking me in the eye. They had stolen from me without ever touching my wallet. And I, the failure, the charity case, the burden who lived rent-free, had unknowingly financed their stability while they ridiculed mine. I didn't confront them. I didn't scream. I didn't show them the documents or demand explanations. I didn't report them, though I could have. Because by then, I had already decided on something better than justice. I wanted them to feel confused, not punished, to sense the rug pulled out from beneath them without ever understanding exactly when or how. So, after freezing the account and moving the remaining funds into a secure trust with restricted access, I waited. Quietly. Strategically. Until the final mortgage payment was made. Until Easter brunch. Until that smirk from my mother, that unprovoked reminder that in her eyes, I was still just the guest who had overstayed her welcome. I had left the house with no intention of turning back, no forwarding address, no goodbyes. But I had made sure that, in the days that followed, the paperwork would arrive. Not all at once, not in a single devastating package, but piece by piece. Letters from the bank. Lenders with questions. Tax offices needing signatures. And, eventually, the formal notice from the family lawyer regarding the restricted access to the trust, an account they could no longer reach, could no longer touch, could no longer use to prop up the lifestyle they had built on the foundation of my silence. I imagined them sitting around the kitchen table, reading those notices with growing confusion, trying to understand when exactly the control had shifted, when the narrative had changed, and why. After all these years of treating me like the weakest link in the family chain, they were suddenly the ones left out in the cold. I didn't answer their calls. I didn't respond to the texts. The messages shifted in tone quickly from confusion to irritation to, eventually, panic, but I read none of them. I wasn't interested in their apologies, not because they wouldn't be sincere, but because I no longer needed them. What I had taken back was bigger than money, bigger than space. I had taken back my story, pried it from the grip of people who had rewritten it for so long I had forgotten I was even allowed to be the narrator. As I sat there on that quiet balcony, listening to the faint sounds of the city waking up around me, distant sirens, a dog barking, the soft rattle of someone dragging their trash bin down the alley, I allowed myself a small smile. Not of satisfaction, not of smugness, but of release. The kind of smile that comes when you've done something irrevocable and absolutely necessary, even if no one else will ever understand why. And maybe that was the point. They would never understand. They would never know the full extent of what I had given or what I had taken back. They would never realize how close they had come to losing everything, or how long they had been standing on a foundation I built with my own hands. And I would never tell them. Because some revenge isn't about destruction. Some revenge is simply the truth withheld.